Hello, I'm Scott Beardsley here today with Shamina Singh, President of the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth, which works to advance sustainable economic growth and financial inclusion around the world. Shamina, welcome.
Thank you.
She has also led government and public affairs at Nike, and in 2015 was appointed by President Obama to a 6-year term on the board of the Corporation for National and Community Service. At the heart of your work is inclusion and access to the global economy for everybody. Can you tell us a little bit about the main challenges to creating access in certain parts of the world and what is actually working to help those people overcome the challenges?
It's an incredibly interesting time to be in the space around inclusion and access, especially when it comes to things like financial services and digital financial inclusion, which is our main focus. As digitization and the power of technology has increased the possibility of what may happen, the truth of the matter is, unless we think about the people who actually are using this technology or who have the ability to increase their productivity because of this technology, we're only solving half the equation. Today, about 2 billion people are currently completely locked out of any kind of formal financial system.
What's an example of an exciting technology or story that might bring this to life?
A very personal example, my mother and my aunts were born without birth certificates in India. So for women to be born without birth certificates, their ages are tracked by much more informal methods. For my family, it was a rope and a knot in a rope every year. So you can imagine when you don't have that type of access with a piece of paper saying, I am who I say I am, or you are who I say I am, your ability to transact and engage in any kind of formal or credible economic activity is severely hindered. And so while we look at all of the opportunity that comes with the technology, so the power of the phone, both the feature phone and the smartphone to transact and allow people to even reach greater heights, we have to make sure that we're also thinking about the practical barriers, the pragmatic barriers, identification, birth certificates, proximity to services, electricity, connectivity, things like that.
So do I get it right that the cell phone, the smartphone, the spreading of technology, for example, through handsets, is one of the enablers that's making a difference?
It's a massive enabler. And again, like any technology, it is an enabler. It's sort of what you do with that technology that's the real differentiator.
So you recently returned from the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. What were some of the interesting conversations you had there, and how is the global community looking to support inclusive economic growth?
The types of conversations that we were engaging with, focused on inclusive growth, really were about this idea of when technology is outpacing the ability for people to actually use the technology, how do you close that gap, or how do you bridge the possibility with the productivity? And those were the types of conversations that we were having, were about humanitarian aid, for example. So one of the things that we announced there was a partnership to create a social enterprise within Mastercard that allows us to help digital aid, humanitarian aid organizations actually convert cash humanitarian aid to digital humanitarian aid. And so I'll say just a little bit more about that.
So it's like texting money?
Well, you know, close. So for example, if you're right now in the current system, if you are a refugee, you are getting, usually there are aid agencies who provide vouchers, or they provide paper vouchers and things like that, that say you'll get 10 bottles of water, 2 blankets, and 3 tents, or whatever those things are. But they're commodity-based paper vouchers. Well, if you're fleeing to a country like Jordan, for example, where we've enabled 2 million refugees to actually carry digital cards that say when you show up in a local economy, so you use your payment to go to a local merchant that supports the Jordanian economy, you can show up with that payment and say, I'd like to, 2 bottles of water, but it's in 3 tenths or whatever that is. But they can deduct it from your account digitally. What we've seen happen in the past is when you show up with a piece of paper, sometimes what happens is if you have a middleman that may not be operating on the right incentive, they take your entire voucher.
They give you no change.
They give you they don't tell you have credit for 3 bottles of water
That's
or
right.
3 tents or things like that. So it shifts the power of the purchasing power to the consumer.
Let's talk a little bit about big data. I find it fascinating that you champion big data as an area of private sector expertise that can be leveraged to help society.
My own view is, if I think about income inequality as the issue of our generation, I think about information inequality as the issue for our time.
Yes.
So what we're seeing is a massive increase and massive abundance of data. And what we're also seeing is the beginnings, frankly, of how we use this data. So like technology, data is an incredible enabler, but it has to be an enabler of something positive.
Yes.
And so what we're working on is what we've coined something called data philanthropy. And so at the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth, we've said we sit inside an incredible company that has access to technology, data, investment, and expertise. How are we making sure, or how are we helping make sure that all of this transaction data that is anonymized and aggregated, how can we use it for social impact? So it's an incredibly exciting time to think about how you take the power of data and use it for social good. Now, you know this better than I do, and I'm sure the UVA community has a lot of experience with this, but in the private sector side, they're building out the capacity for the commercial use of data to make better decisions, evidence-based decision making. But how do we make sure that in the social side, we're building the same capabilities, or at least trying to build out capacity so that this divide doesn't increase any more than it needs to? I often think that for folks in the social sector, they don't even know that they're in a war right now around
Yes.
data. They have no idea that they even need to build out this capability. But unless we start to really think about capacity building around data access and data analytics in the public sector, especially in the social sector, I really fear that we're going to create something much worse than the income divide.
What is your estimate for the, call it the information or the digital have-nots in the world right now? I mean, we've come through a period of time where there's been a dramatic increase in the number of people with cell phones and access to telephone technology, but how many folks out of the, 7.5 or 8 billion people we have in the world do you feel being at risk of not being connected to the inclusion?
So here's the good news, is that there are a number of companies who have actually committed to increasing access to the formal economy and with numerical targets. So for example, Mastercard raised their hand and said, look, we have the technology, we now know what the problem is. We're committed to bringing 500 million new consumers into the formal economy by 2020. We've also committed to bringing 40 million new micro merchants, small businesses into the formal economy. But we're not alone.
Right.
The World Bank is also committed to bringing in other companies like Unilever, Coca-Cola, others are sort of saying, this makes sense for our supply chain to make sure that people are all digitally connected. So this intersectionality of the solution and the problem are coming together in a way that allows us to actually say, we're going to solve the access problem by 2020. That's going to happen. But making sure that we're answering the question, to what end and for what purpose, is the bigger, more interesting question that we at the center are seeking to understand.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.